The envelope came stapled shut, which should have told me something right there. County offices don't staple things unless they're trying to keep you from seeing what's underneath before you've committed to opening it. I tore it anyway, standing at the mailbox, truck still running behind me. The number at the bottom wasn't a typo. It couldn't be. Someone had added acreage to my parcel. Land past the tree line I'd walked 100 times. Land that belonged to nobody in my family. Not on any deed my father ever signed. I called the assessor's office from the driveway, engine still ticking as it cooled. The woman on the line didn't sound surprised. She sounded rehearsed. The record reflects what the record reflects. I stood there a long moment after she hung up, staring past my own fence line at the acreage the county now insisted was mine to pay for. How long had this been sitting in their system? And how much had I already handed over for ground I never touched? Before I get into how deep this went, comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Country, city, state, whatever you're comfortable sharing. I'm always curious how far these stories travel. Now back to it. The land in question had been in my family for going on 30 years. My father bought it before I was born, cleared half of it himself, built the fence line by hand one summer when he couldn't afford to hire it out. When he passed, it came to me, not just as property, but as the last thing that still felt like his. I wasn't rich, I wasn't struggling either, but every dollar had a place to go, and an unexpected jump in property tax wasn't something I could just absorb and forget about, especially not for ground that had never been mine to begin with. What I didn't know yet, standing there with that bill in my hand, was that this wasn't the county's first mistake. It was just the first one anybody had bothered to notice. I didn't wait for a callback. 2 days after that phone call, I drove straight to the county assessor's office, the tax bill folded in my jacket pocket like something I needed to keep close. The building was one of those flat, beige government structures that made everyone inside look tired before their shift even started. I gave my name at the counter and asked for whoever handled parcel disputes. The clerk didn't even look up. She just pointed toward a door at the end of the hall. Vivian Holcomb, she's the assessor. She'll want to see this herself. I didn't know that name yet. I would know it very well by the end of this. Her office was neat in a way that felt deliberate. Everything squared off, nothing out of place, like the room itself had been trained to give nothing away. She was maybe mid-50s, sharp in her posture, the kind of sharp that comes from years of not being questioned. Mr. Fairweather. She said my name like she'd already read the file. Maybe she had. I understand there's a concern with your parcel. There's an error, I said, sliding the bill across her desk. This acreage isn't mine. It never has been. She glanced at it for exactly as long as it took to be polite, then slid it back. The record reflects what's on file. If you believe there's a discrepancy, you're welcome to file a formal request for review. I'm not filing a request. I'm telling you the number is wrong. Mr. Fairweather, our surveys are conducted by licensed professionals. The system doesn't simply generate errors on its own. That was the first time I heard that phrase. The system doesn't make mistakes. I'd hear it again, and again. Each time it came out of her mouth a little smoother, like she'd worn the words down into something comfortable. Then how do you explain half an acre appearing on my parcel that was never there when my father owned this land? For the first time, something flickered behind her eyes. Not doubt, something closer to irritation, like I'd interrupted a process that wasn't supposed to include people like me asking questions. Parcel boundaries are updated periodically to reflect the most accurate data available. Accurate compared to what? Whose survey? When? She folded her hands on the desk, and I understood then that this wasn't a conversation. It was a script, and she'd decided I wasn't worth deviating from it for. If you'd like to request the historical survey documentation, that request goes through records. It can take several weeks to process. Weeks. For a document that already exists somewhere in this building. That's the process, Mr. Fairweather. I sat there another minute, waiting for something, an apology, an acknowledgement, anything that suggested she saw me as more than an inconvenience standing between her and lunch. It didn't come. I'll file the request, I said, standing. But I want it on record that I raised this today, in person, before any more payments come due. Noted, she said, already reaching for the next folder on her desk before I'd even turned around. I walked out of that building angrier than when I walked in, which I hadn't expected. I'd gone in assuming a mistake. I walked out with the distinct feeling that mistakes, in that office, weren't things anyone was in a hurry to find. In the truck, I sat for a minute before starting the engine. Something about the way she'd said periodically updated stuck with me. Updated from what? Based on what? If the boundary had shifted, somebody somewhere had drawn a new line. Somebody had signed off on it. That meant there was a paper trail, whether Vivian Holcomb wanted to make it easy to find or not. I didn't know yet how far back that trail went. I didn't know it would lead to a survey done before I was even born. A mistake copied forward year after year by people who'd never once thought to check it against the ground itself. All I knew, driving home past the fence line my father built with his own hands, was that I wasn't going to let this go. Not because of the money, though the money mattered. Because somewhere in that building was a piece of paper that said land was mine that wasn't. And another piece of paper, somewhere older, that would prove it never had been. I just had to find it before they buried it under enough paperwork that I gave up looking. The formal request took 11 days to even get acknowledged, and when it finally landed in my mailbox, it wasn't the survey I'd asked for. It was a form letter confirming receipt of my request, with an estimated processing time of 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks. Meanwhile, another tax cycle was closing in, and I'd be expected to pay the same inflated number all over again, unless something changed. I wasn't going to sit around waiting on a records department that didn't seem in any hurry to find anything. So I started looking myself. The county courthouse kept old plat maps on file, some of them scanned, most of them not. I spent 2 afternoons in a back room with a clerk who actually seemed sympathetic, pulling records that hadn't been touched in years. Dust on folders that hadn't been opened since before I'd learned to drive. What I found didn't answer everything, but it answered enough to make my stomach turn. The original plat map for my parcel, filed the year my father bought the land, showed a boundary that matched exactly what I'd grown up walking. No extra half acre, no disputed tree line, just the property my father had paid for, fair and clean. Then I found a second map, newer, filed almost 15 years later, during a county-wide resurvey project I'd never even heard of, and there it was. The same parcel, same number, but with a boundary quietly shifted to include land that had never belonged to it before. Nobody had told my father about that shift. There was no notice in the file, no signature acknowledging a change, nothing except a stamped date and an assessor's initials I didn't recognize. I sat there in that back room for a long time, just staring at 2 maps that told 2 different stories about the same piece of ground. The clerk, a soft-spoken older woman who'd been pulling files for me all afternoon, finally leaned over and said something I wasn't expecting. "You're not the first person to come looking at that resurvey." I asked her what she meant. She hesitated, the way people do when they know more than they're supposed to say out loud in a government building. "Just a few folks over the years, asking questions about boundaries that didn't match up. Nothing ever came of it, far as I know." That single sentence changed the shape of everything for me. This wasn't a one-time clerical slip. This was a pattern. A resurvey that had quietly redrawn lines across the county, and an assessor's office that had spent years treating any question about it as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a mistake to be fixed. I made copies of both maps before I left, my hands moving faster than I wanted them to, like some part of me expected someone to walk in and take them back. That night, I laid both maps out on my dining table and studied them side by side until the numbers blurred. My father's signature was on the original deed. There was no signature anywhere authorizing the change that came after, just an initialed stamp and a date, buried in a filing cabinet nobody had opened in years. I thought about calling Vivian Holcomb's office the next morning, maps in hand, expecting this to be the moment everything turned around. But something stopped me. If I walked in now with proof, I'd be handing her time to prepare an explanation before I even had a chance to ask the right questions. Instead, I called a private surveyor. Her name was Kayla Dunmore, recommended by a neighbor who'd used her for a boundary dispute years back. She was direct on the phone in a way that felt like a relief after weeks of vague government language. I explained what I'd found. She didn't sound surprised. "Resurvey errors happen more than people think," she said. "Especially with older county-wide projects. Half the time, nobody checks the new lines against the original monuments. They just extrapolate from bad data and call it updated." I asked her what it would cost to get an independent survey done, one that would hold up if this ever went further than a conversation in an assessor's office. She gave me a number that stung a little, given everything I was already fighting to get back. But I thought about the 2 maps sitting on my table, about the stamped initials with no accountability behind them, and about a woman who'd looked me in the eye and told me the system doesn't make mistakes. I told Kayla to schedule it as soon as she could. 3 days later, a letter arrived from the assessor's office. Not the survey I'd requested. A different letter entirely, cold and formal, warning that repeated inquiries regarding the current parcel assessment could be considered. Their words: "An abuse of the administrative review process," and that further correspondence should be directed strictly through official channels. I read that letter twice, Then a third time, trying to understand how asking a question about my own property had turned into something they were treating like a threat. It didn't scare me. If anything, it told me exactly what I needed to know. Nobody sends a letter like that over an honest mistake. You send a letter like that when you're worried somebody's finally looking too closely at something you'd rather stayed buried. I put both maps in a folder, added the county's warning letter behind them, and started what would become a much thicker file than I ever expected to need. I have concerns about being called delinquent for disputing a number your own office admitted needed review, I said. I filed the request. I have the confirmation letter. Filing a request doesn't suspend your obligation to pay the assessed amount, Vivian said. That's standard policy. So, I'm supposed to pay for land I don't own while I wait weeks for you to confirm what I'm already showing you is wrong. If the review determines an error, you'll be issued a refund at that time. And if I don't pay in the meantime? There was a pause, short but deliberate. Then penalties will apply, and if the balance remains unresolved, it could result in a lien against the property. A lien. On land my father had paid off free and clear decades ago, on the same ground his name was still on, buried somewhere in that same filing cabinet as the map that started all of this. You're threatening to put a lien on my property because I caught an error in yours. I'm explaining the process, Mr. Fairweather, nothing more. I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. Sitting there in my truck outside the feed store, hands still on the wheel, I understood something clearly for the first time. This wasn't about a clerical mistake anymore, if it ever had been. This was about an office protecting itself, and I was the inconvenience standing in the way of that. That evening I called Kayla Dunmore and told her about the notice, the lien threat, all of it. She didn't sound surprised, which somehow made it worse. They do this, she said. Not always, but often enough. Once someone starts asking real questions, offices like that tend to switch from cooperative to defensive fast. It's not usually personal. It's just easier for them to pressure one homeowner than admit a systemic problem. Easier for them, I said. Not for me. No, she agreed. Not for you. She told me the survey was still on schedule and reminded me to keep every piece of paper the county sent me from this point forward, dated, organized, copied. If this went further, and it sounded like it might, documentation would matter more than anything I said out loud. So that's what I did. I bought a plain accordion folder from the drugstore and started sorting. The original plat map, the newer one with the shifted boundary, the confirmation of my request for review, the warning letter about abuse of process. Now this notice, threatening a lien over a bill I'd never refused to pay, only refused to pay incorrectly. I also started keeping a written log, dates and summaries of every call, every letter, every name I spoke to, not because I thought I'd need it in court. At that point, I still hoped this could be resolved with nothing more than a corrected number on a piece of paper. I kept the log because I no longer trusted that a phone call to that office would be remembered the same way by both sides. 2 days before Kayla's survey team was scheduled to walk the property, I found Simone Aldercroft standing at her mailbox when I pulled into my driveway. She lived 3 lots down, a widow who'd been on that road longer than I had. She waved me over, tax bill in her hand, an expression on her face I recognized because I'd worn it myself a few weeks earlier. "Owen," she said, "does your bill look right to you this year?" I asked her what she meant. Mine went up, not a little. And when I called to ask why, the woman on the phone told me the boundary had been updated to reflect the most accurate data available. I stood there in my driveway with my own accordion folder still on the passenger seat of my truck and felt something shift in my chest. Not surprise exactly. Confirmation of something I'd already started to suspect. This wasn't a mistake that had happened to me alone. It was bigger than one parcel. Bigger than one homeowner arguing with one assessor, and Vivian Holcomb's office had been managing it, quietly, for longer than any of us realized. Kayla's crew walked the property on a Thursday morning, and I took the day off just to be there while they worked. Watching them set up the equipment, run their lines, check and recheck against the old monuments still buried at the corners of the original parcel, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not relief, exactly. More like the first solid ground under a conversation that had been nothing but shifting sand since the day that tax bill arrived. It took most of the day. Kayla walked me through it as they went, showing me where the original iron pins were still sunk in the ground, exactly where the first plat map said they'd be. Then she showed me where the county's newer boundary line fell instead, a stretch of nearly half an acre past those pins, running straight through what had always just been the backfield, as far as I'd ever known it. "This isn't a rounding error," she said, crouched near one of the old markers, brushing dirt away from the metal cap. "Somebody either transcribed this wrong during that county-wide resurvey, or they extrapolated a boundary without ever coming out to check it against the original monuments. Either way, This line was never verified against what's actually in the ground. I asked her how something like that happens across an entire county and nobody catches it. Because most people don't check, she said. They see a number on a bill, they pay it, they move on. It's only when someone actually pushes back that anyone looks closely enough to find it. She promised me a full written report within a week, signed and stamped, something that would hold up wherever I needed to take it next. That same week, Simone knocked on my door one evening, a folder of her own tucked under her arm. She'd done some digging after our conversation at the mailbox, mostly just pulling old bills from a box in her closet, comparing numbers year over year. What she found lined up almost exactly with my own timeline. Her assessment had jumped during the same county-wide resurvey period, the same vague language about boundaries being updated to reflect the most accurate data available. I always figured it was just taxes going up like everything else, she said, sitting at my kitchen table, sliding her old bills across to me one by one. I never thought to question the acreage itself. Neither had I, until a stapled envelope forced the question on me. We started comparing notes properly after that. 2 households, 2 sets of inflated boundaries, both traced back to the same resurvey project, both handled by the same office. Under Vivian Holcomb's signature on at least one of the internal review documents Simone had managed to get through an earlier records request of her own. It was Simone, actually, who suggested we weren't the only ones. She remembered another neighbor, moved away years back, who'd complained about a similar issue, and eventually just paid the higher bill rather than fight it. Nobody had ever connected those dots before, because nobody had ever had a reason to sit down and compare. I started making calls, not to the assessor's office this time, but to the county clerk's records division, requesting historical review files related to the resurvey project itself. It took persistence and more waiting than I wanted, but eventually a records clerk, different from the one who'd helped me before, this one older, closer to retirement, mentioned something almost in passing. "You'll want to talk to Wendell Ashcroft if you can find him," she said. He worked survey crews for the county back when that whole resurvey was done. Retired years ago now, but he'd know more about how that project actually ran than anybody still on staff. Finding Wendell wasn't hard. He was listed, still living not 20 minutes from the courthouse. And when I called and explained who I was and what I'd found, there was a long pause on the line before he spoke. I wondered if anybody would ever come asking about that project, he said. We met at his kitchen table 2 days later. He was maybe 65, steady hands, a way of talking that made it clear he'd spent a career being precise about things other people never thought twice about. He remembered the resurvey well, said it had been rushed, underfunded, half the crew working off old aerial photographs instead of physically walking every boundary the way the job actually called for. There were shortcuts taken, he said. I raised it at the time. Told my supervisor some of these lines weren't matching the original monuments, and I was told the project was on a deadline and to keep moving. I asked him if he'd be willing to say that somewhere official, a hearing, a sworn statement, anything that carried more weight than a conversation at his kitchen table. He was quiet for a moment, looking down at his hands like he was weighing something he'd carried a long time. I should have said something louder back then, he said finally. Maybe this is the chance to do that properly. Walking out of his house that afternoon, folder thicker than it had ever been, I finally felt like I had more than a complaint. I had a witness who'd been inside the project when the mistake was made. I had an independent survey proving the boundary didn't match the ground. I had a neighbor with the same error under the same signature. And somewhere in all of it, I had enough to stop asking Vivian Holcomb's office to fix this quietly and start making them answer for it in a room where they couldn't just tell me the record reflects what the record reflects. The county's appeals hearing was scheduled for the following month. I intended to walk into that room with everything I had and make sure it was the county explaining itself for once, instead of me. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. Rows of folding chairs facing a raised table where 3 board members sat, Louise Whitfield in the center chair with a nameplate in front of her and a stack of files at her elbow. I'd pictured something grander, given how much of my life had led up to this moment. Instead, it looked like the kind of room where a school board might argue over a budget line, fluorescent lights humming overhead, a water pitcher sweating on the corner of the table nobody had touched. I sat near the front with my folder, Kayla's signed survey report inside it, along with copies of both plat maps, the county's own warning letters, and a written statement from Wendell that he'd agreed to read aloud himself if called. Simone sat 2 seats down from me, her own folder in her lap, quiet but steady. Behind us, more chairs filled than I expected. Word travels fast on a short road when 2 neighbors start comparing tax bills out loud. Vivian arrived a few minutes later, walking in like she owned the room, a thin folder tucked under one arm that looked far too light to contain anything close to what I was carrying. She took a seat at a table facing the board, gave me a brief glance that registered nothing, and opened her folder without another word. If she felt any weight to the room filling in behind me, she didn't show it. Louise Whitfield called the hearing to order and read the case number aloud, along with a short summary of the dispute. A parcel boundary discrepancy, a request for reassessment, a homeowner disputing the current tax liability. Put that plainly, it almost sounded small. I knew it wasn't. "Mr. Fairweather," Louise said, "you may present your case." I stood, and for a moment my voice didn't want to cooperate. Then I thought about my father's signature on that original deed, and about a boundary that had shifted without anyone ever telling him, and the words came easier after that. I laid it out in order. The original plat map, filed the year my father bought the land. The second map, filed during the countywide resurvey, showing a boundary shifted without notice or signature. Kayla's independent survey, confirming the original monuments still sat exactly where the first map said they would, nowhere near the county's current line. I held up each document as I referenced it, making sure the board could see there was nothing here built on assumption. "This isn't a dispute about opinion," I said. "It's a documented error, still being charged against me 3 years later, despite my raising it through every channel your office provided." Vivian responded when it was her turn, her tone even, almost bored, like she'd delivered this same explanation to this same board before. "Boundary lines are periodically updated to reflect the most accurate surveying data available. Occasional discrepancies can occur during large-scale resurvey projects. That doesn't indicate fraud or misconduct, simply a difference in methodology." "A difference in methodology," I repeated, "that added land to my parcel that was never there, and that your office refused to even review without a formal request that then took months to process." "The process exists for a reason, Mr. Fairweather. The process exists to slow people down long enough that most of them give up," I said. I didn't. A murmur moved through the room behind me, quiet but present. I glanced back and saw a few more neighbors I recognized, drawn in by word of mouth once Simone and I had started comparing notes out loud around the neighborhood. One of them, an older man I only knew by sight from the feed store, gave me a small nod, like he'd been waiting a long time for somebody to say this out loud in a room that mattered. Louise raised a hand for order, then turned back to Vivienne. "Ms. Holcomb, can your office produce documentation showing this boundary change was reviewed and verified against the original survey monuments at the time it was made?" For the first time, Vivienne hesitated, just slightly, a beat longer than her usual rehearsed rhythm. "The resurvey project was conducted under standard county procedure at the time." "That's not what I asked," Louise said. "Was this specific boundary change verified against the original monuments? Yes or no?" "I'd have to review the historical file in full to answer that with certainty." "Then I'd suggest you do that," Louise said, "because right now we have an independent, licensed survey in front of us confirming the original monuments are still in the ground, exactly where the original plat map says they should be. That's not a difference in methodology. That's a boundary that was never checked." Vivian's composure didn't crack outright, but something in her posture shifted, like she was recalculating the room in real time. She glanced down at her folder, thin as it was, as though hoping something new might appear inside it. I asked to introduce one more piece of evidence. Simone stood beside me and briefly described her own situation, her assessment rising during the same resurvey period, under the same vague language, the same signature appearing on the internal review. 2 households now, not one. The murmur behind us grew a little louder, and one of the other board members, a quieter man who'd said nothing until now, leaned toward Louise and said something I couldn't quite hear. Then I called Wendell. He stood slowly, walked to the small podium set up for public comment, and read his statement in the same steady voice he'd used at his kitchen table. He described the rushed timeline of the original resurvey project, the reliance on old aerial photographs instead of physical verification, the concerns he'd personally raised at the time and been told to set aside for the sake of the deadline. When he finished, the room was quiet, in a different way than before, not restless, attentive. Even Vivian, for a moment, sat still enough that I could tell she was listening to every word instead of preparing her next response. Louise looked directly at Vivian. "Ms. Holcomb, does the county have any response to this testimony?" "I wasn't with the department during that project," Vivian said. "I can't speak to internal decisions made before my time. You can speak to whether your office investigated these concerns once they were raised to you directly," Louise said, which, according to Mr. Fairweather's timeline, was over 3 years ago. Vivian didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice had lost some of the smoothness it carried at the start of the hearing. We follow the review process as outlined by county policy. A policy that, from what I'm seeing today, seems to have discouraged review rather than provided it, Louise said. I sat back down at that point, folder closed in my lap, and let the board members talk among themselves in low voices, papers sliding back and forth between them. I didn't need to say anything else. For the first time since that stapled envelope landed in my mailbox, I watched the room's attention shift entirely away from me and onto the woman who'd spent months telling me the system doesn't make mistakes. Louise announced that the board would review all submitted documentation, including Kayla's survey, Wendell's testimony, and the historical plat maps, and that a formal ruling would follow within 30 days. She thanked us for our patience, though patience wasn't really the word I would have used for the last 3 years. Walking out of that building with Simone beside me, neither of us said much at first. It was Wendell who finally spoke, adjusting his jacket in the parking lot, looking more at ease than I'd seen him since we first met at his kitchen table. "Feels different," he said, saying it out loud in a room instead of just carrying it around. I understood exactly what he meant. 30 days felt like a long wait after 3 years, but for the first time, it felt like a wait that was actually going somewhere. Section 8, Climax, the final showdown, expanded clean version. The 30 days felt longer than the 3 years that came before them, which didn't make sense until I understood why. All that time, I'd been the one pushing, digging, making calls, filing requests. Now, I was just waiting, and waiting had never been the hard part for me. Waiting for someone else to decide whether they'd finally admit what the evidence already showed. That was different. Kayla called partway through that stretch to tell me the county had reached out to her directly, requesting a copy of her full survey report along with her licensing credentials. She didn't sound worried about it. If anything, she sounded almost pleased. "They're not questioning my methodology," she said. "They're just making sure they understand exactly what they're dealing with before this goes any further. That's usually a sign they know which way this is heading." Wendell called a few days after that, mentioning almost in passing that a county records supervisor had phoned him asking to confirm the dates and details of his original employment on the resurvey project. He answered every question plainly, the same way he had at the hearing, and told me afterward that it felt less like an interrogation and more like someone finally doing the homework that should have been done years earlier. Simone and I started comparing notes more regularly during that month, mostly out of nervous energy neither of us knew what to do with. She'd talk to other neighbors when she saw them at the mailbox or in the yard, and slowly more stories started surfacing. A family 2 streets over who'd sold their property years back at what turned out to be an unfairly high assessed value, never knowing the boundary behind their new fence line hadn't been the boundary at all. An elderly couple who'd quietly paid an inflated bill for over a decade because nobody in the family had the time or the energy to fight it. One of those neighbors, a retired school teacher named Della Fenwick, who lived at the far end of our road, called me directly after hearing about the first hearing through Simone. She'd never filed a dispute in her life, she told me, mostly because she assumed a government office wouldn't make a mistake it couldn't explain. When I told her what the original resurvey project actually involved, old aerial photographs instead of real fieldwork, a rushed deadline, a survey crew told to keep moving instead of get it right, she went quiet on the phone for a long moment. "I've been paying on land that was never mine for 11 years, she said finally. "I want to be there when they announce whatever they're going to announce." None of those stories were part of my case directly, but they confirmed something I'd suspected since that first afternoon in the courthouse back room. This wasn't a mistake that touched one parcel. It was a pattern stitched into the county's records, and it had taken one stapled envelope and one stubborn homeowner to finally start pulling that thread loose. On the 28th day, a letter arrived requesting my presence at a follow-up session, described only as a final review hearing where the board would issue its ruling in person rather than by mail. I called Simone and Wendell both, and neither hesitated when I asked if they'd come. Della asked if she could attend as well, even though her own case hadn't been formally filed yet. I told her she had every right to be there. The room was fuller this time than it had been at the first hearing. Word had clearly spread beyond just our small stretch of road. I recognized faces I hadn't seen the first time, along with a reporter from the local paper sitting near the back with a notepad open on her knee, and a second man beside her I didn't recognize, who I'd later learn worked for a regional television station covering local government. Vivian arrived with a much thicker folder than before, and for a moment I wondered if she'd finally found something that would turn this around in her favor. She sat at her table without the same composed stillness she'd carried into the first hearing. Something in the way she arranged her papers looked less like preparation and more like stalling. Louise Whitfield opened the session by summarizing what the board had reviewed over the previous month: the independent survey, the historical plat maps, Wendell's sworn testimony, and, notably, an internal audit the county had apparently conducted on its own after the first hearing, prompted by questions the board itself had raised about the resurvey project's original methodology. That audit, it turned out, was the thicker folder in front of Vivienne. Louise asked her to summarize its findings for the room. Vivienne opened it slowly. When she spoke, her voice had none of the smooth, rehearsed quality I'd grown used to over the past several months. The internal audit identified inconsistencies in the original resurvey documentation. Several boundary lines, including the parcel in question, were adjusted without corresponding field verification against existing monuments. How many parcels specifically? Louise asked. Does the audit identify as affected by this same issue? Vivian hesitated, flipping to a page marked with a tab. The audit identifies 14 parcels along the affected survey corridor showing discrepancies between the original monuments and the boundaries currently on record. A murmur moved through the room, louder than anything from the first hearing. 14, not 2. Not a handful of unlucky homeowners who happened to notice. 14 households who'd been paying, in some cases for over a decade, on land that had never legally belonged to them, or losing acreage that legally did. In plain terms, Louise said once the room settled, the county is confirming that Mr. Fairweather's boundary, and at least 13 other parcels on or near the same road, were altered without the verification your own policy requires. That's what the audit indicates, Vivian said. I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for 3 years. Not triumph exactly, something closer to finally being believed. Louise continued, her tone measured but unmistakably pointed. This board has also reviewed correspondence submitted by Mr. Fairweather, including a letter from your office characterizing his repeated inquiries as an abuse of the administrative review process. Given today's findings, can you explain why a homeowner raising a legitimate, ultimately confirmed error was met with a warning rather than an investigation? Vivian's hand stilled on the folder in front of her. At the time, the office believed the assessment reflected accurate data. For 3 years, Louise said, despite a formal request for review sitting in your files that entire time. The review process has since been updated, Vivian said. Requests of this nature are now escalated more directly to survey verification. Since this hearing began, Louise said. It wasn't a question. Vivian didn't answer that one at all. One of the other board members, the quieter man who'd said little during the first hearing, leaned forward for the first time. Ms. Holcomb, was Mr. Ashcroft's account of the original resurvey, the reliance on aerial photography instead of physical verification, addressed anywhere in this audit? The audit confirms that field verification was inconsistently applied across the project, Vivian said. In several sections, aerial data was used in place of ground surveys due to time constraints. So the shortcuts he described in his testimony are documented in your own audit. Yes. The word came out smaller than anything else she'd said all afternoon. Louise turned to the rest of the board briefly, a few quiet words exchanged, before she addressed the room again. Based on the evidence presented, including the independent survey conducted by a licensed surveyor, the testimony of a former county survey employee directly involved in the original project, and the county's own internal audit confirming the boundary was never properly verified, this board finds in favor of the petitioner, Mr. Owen Fairweather. She continued before I could fully register what she'd said. The parcel boundary will be corrected to reflect the original verified survey. Furthermore, given the documented 3-year period during which this error was repeatedly raised and repeatedly dismissed, the board is ordering a full refund of the excess taxes paid during that period, along with a formal review of all 14 parcels identified in the county's own audit, with corrected assessments and appropriate refunds to follow for each affected household. Simone reached over and gripped my hand for a moment before letting go. Wendell, a few seats down, exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since he first sat down at his kitchen table months earlier and told me he wondered if anybody would ever come asking. Della, near the back, pressed a hand to her mouth, and I understood exactly what 11 years of quiet overpayment must have felt like, finally hearing someone else say it out loud in a room that mattered. Vivienne closed her folder without another word, gathered her things, and left through a side door before most of the room had even finished absorbing what had just been said. She didn't look at me on her way out. I found I didn't need her to. Outside, The reporter and the television producer both caught up with me on the courthouse steps, asking a string of quick questions. How long this had taken, what finally pushed the county to investigate, whether I'd known other households were affected when I first started. I answered as plainly as I could, mostly still turning Louise's words over in my head. 14 parcels, 3 years of overpayment, refunded, a boundary, corrected, a pattern, finally acknowledged instead of buried. Simone stood beside me on those steps, her own case now folded quietly into the same ruling, and Wendell a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who'd finally set something down after carrying it much longer than he should have had to. Della lingered near the courthouse doors, already exchanging numbers with another neighbor whose name I didn't recognize, the two of them comparing tax bills right there on the steps, like it was the most natural thing in the world. None of it undid the 3 years, but for the first time since that stapled envelope landed in my mailbox, the ground under my feet finally matched the paper that was supposed to describe it. The refund check arrived 3 weeks after the ruling, a plain envelope from the county treasurer's office that looked almost too ordinary to hold the number printed inside it. 3 years of overpayment, calculated down to the dollar, along with a formal notice confirming the parcel's corrected boundary, matching exactly what Kayla's survey and my father's original deed had said all along. I sat at my kitchen table with that check for a long time before I did anything else with it. Not because I didn't know what it meant. Because I did, finally, and it took a minute to let that settle. 3 years of a number I'd known was wrong. 3 years of a woman telling me the system doesn't make mistakes, and here was the county's own signature confirming that it had. Simone's refund came the same week, along with a corrected assessment that dropped her bill back to where it should have been years earlier. She stopped by that Saturday with a pie, setting it on my counter like we were celebrating something ordinary instead of the end of a 3-year fight most people would have given up on long before it got this far. "I almost didn't say anything to you that day at the mailbox," she admitted, cutting into the pie before I'd even found plates. "Figured it was just me being paranoid about a number going up." "I'm glad you said something," I told her, and meant it more than the sentence probably conveyed. Wendell called a few days later, not about anything urgent, just to talk. He mentioned that a few people from his old survey crew had reached out after seeing the story pick up some local coverage. Some of them relieved somebody had finally said out loud what they'd quietly known for years. One of them, he said, had kept his own notes from that resurvey project all this time, tucked away in a box in his garage, never sure what to do with them. "Funny how that works," Wendell said. "Everybody keeps a little piece of the truth in a drawer somewhere, waiting for somebody else to ask the right question." The county's promised review of the other 13 parcels moved slower than any of us would have liked, but it moved. Over the following months, letters went out to each affected household, along with corrected assessments and, for those who'd been overpaying, refunds of their own. Della Fenwick's case resolved a little over 2 months after the hearing, and she called me the day her check arrived, her voice bright in a way I hadn't heard the first time we spoke. 11 years, she said. I keep saying that number out loud just to remind myself it's actually over. I understood the impulse completely. Not every household came out the same way, and it felt important to sit with that instead of glossing over it. 2 of the 14 parcels turned out to owe the county a small correction, rather than receive one, their boundaries having been drawn short, rather than long during the same rushed resurvey. One of those homeowners, a younger man who'd only bought his property a few years back, told me at a community meeting that he almost resented the timing of it. His refund on one hand, the reminder that the same broken process had worked against him in his own transaction on the other. I didn't have a neat answer for that. The audit had exposed a mess, not a clean story, and some of that mess didn't resolve the way I would have wanted it to for everyone involved. The county held a public session a month after the ruling specifically to walk through the procedural changes coming out of the review. I went mostly out of curiosity, half expecting more of the same vague language I'd grown used to from that office. Instead, a different assessor, filling in temporarily while the department restructured, laid out the new requirement plainly. No boundary adjustment could be entered into county records without a physical field verification against existing monuments, signed off by a licensed surveyor, with a copy provided directly to the affected property owner before any tax adjustment took effect. It was such a small thing to ask for, I remember thinking, sitting in that same folding chair from the first hearing. A signature, a copy sent to the person actually affected. It shouldn't have taken 3 years and 14 households to get there. Vivian Holcomb didn't attend that session. I heard through the same local paper that had covered the hearing that she'd been reassigned to a records division role with reduced authority over assessments, though the article was careful not to call it a demotion outright. Whether that came from genuine reflection on her part, or simply the pressure of 14 households and a reporter watching closely, I couldn't say. I found I didn't need to know which. The outcome mattered more than her reasons for reaching it. What stayed with me longest wasn't the check, though I won't pretend that didn't matter. It was walking my property line again, weeks after the ruling, following the same fence my father built decades earlier, knowing for the first time in 3 years that the boundary in the county's records finally matched the boundary in the ground. There's a particular kind of relief in that, not just being right, being restored to something that should never have been in question in the first place. I thought about my father a lot during those weeks, about the fence posts he'd sunk into the ground himself one summer, about the deed with his signature that had sat quietly in a filing cabinet for decades, waiting for someone to actually read it against the newer paperwork, instead of just trusting that newer meant more accurate. I don't know if he ever imagined his signature would end up being the thing that finally settled a fight neither of us saw coming. Simone and I still talk regularly, comparing notes out of habit more than necessity now. She jokes that we should start a neighborhood watch for tax bills instead of break-ins, and I tell her that's not entirely a joke anymore. Not on a road where 14 households just learned how easily an error can sit unquestioned for years if nobody happens to open a stapled envelope at the right moment. Wendell, for his part, seems lighter these days. I ran into him at the hardware store a few weeks after everything wrapped up, and he told me he'd started writing down some of his memories from those old survey projects. Not for any particular reason, just so the details wouldn't disappear the way so much of that resurvey's history nearly had. Somebody should have a record of how it actually happened, he said, instead of just the record they wrote down afterward. I think about that sentence often. How much of what we accept as fact is really just whatever got written down first, and how much effort it takes to correct that once it's sitting comfortably in a filing cabinet nobody wants to reopen. The land itself looks the same as it always did. Boundaries don't announce themselves in the ground the way they do on paper, but walking it now feels different, knowing the paper finally agrees with what was always true underneath it. My father's fence line, unchanged and unclaimed by anyone else, exactly where he left it. 14 households got their ground back, in one form or another, though not all of them cleanly, and not all of them happily. Some of it was money, some of it was simply the acknowledgement that they hadn't imagined the discrepancy, hadn't been paranoid or difficult for asking questions a system would rather they hadn't. I think that mattered as much as any refund check, for most of us. 3 years is a long time to fight over half an acre and a number on a bill. Looking back now, I don't know that I'd call it a fight over land at all. Not really. It was a fight over whether the people responsible for keeping the records straight would actually be held to that responsibility, or whether they'd keep leaning on the comfort of a system nobody was supposed to question. That comfort is gone now, at least in this county, at least for a while. I like to think that's worth more than the refund itself. People ask me sometimes if I regret how long this took. 3 years of letters, phone calls, a hearing room, a second hearing room, all over a boundary line that should have been fixed with a single phone call the day I first noticed it. I don't regret it. I just wish I'd understood sooner how much I needed to push before anyone would actually listen. If there's one thing I'd tell somebody standing where I stood, staring at a bill that doesn't add up, it's this. Don't assume the paperwork is right just because it came from an office with a seal on the letterhead. Records get copied forward year after year by people who never once walk the ground they're describing. Nobody double checks unless somebody forces them to. I found that out the hard way, but I'd rather you find it out from me than the way I did. I still walk that fence line most evenings, the one my father built by hand, and I still catch myself feeling a version of relief that doesn't fade the way I expected it to. It's not about the refund check anymore, though I won't pretend that didn't matter at the time. It's about knowing the ground under my feet finally matches what's written down about it. That's a strange thing to have to fight for, but I understand now that plenty of people never do, either because they don't notice, or because they notice and decide it's not worth the years it might take. 14 households on my road alone were affected by the same mistake. 14. I think about that number more than almost anything else from this whole ordeal. How many other counties, other roads, other stapled envelopes are sitting in mailboxes right now, waiting for somebody to open them and ask the one question that gets brushed aside 100 times before anybody finally answers it honestly? So if you take one thing away from this, let it be that question. Pull your deed. Pull your last survey, if you have one. Compare it against what your current tax bill says you own. It takes 20 minutes, and for most people, it'll turn up nothing at all. But for some of you, it might turn up exactly what it turned up for me and 13 of my neighbors. I'd genuinely like to hear if it does. Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever caught an error like this in your own property records, or if this story is pushing you to go check for the first time. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. I tell true stories like this one regularly, real disputes, real outcomes, the kind of thing that reminds you the system isn't as untouchable as it wants you to believe. 3 years ago, I thought I was fighting to get my money back. Looking back now, I think I was really just fighting to be believed. Turns out, those are the same fight, more often than people realize. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.